of the Lenten series. Turn this off. If I have two microphones on, it's way too loud. So last time we left off with Moses coming before the Pharaoh, and everybody thinks, right, that he said those famous words, "Let my people go," because that's what we've kind of been ingrained. And eventually he's going to say basically that. But at first, he only asked for 1 week worth of time, 3-day journey into the desert, a Sabbath rest for the people where they could reconnect with God for the first time in 400 years, and then 3 days back. So 1 week of time, right? 1 week of time just for that day of worship in the desert for God's people, and 1 Sabbath rest, right? After 400 years of not having a single day off, essentially. And then he said, but if you refuse this offer, because this people, the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, are my firstborn child of all the nations of the world. All the other nations are the younger brothers and sisters, if you will, of the Hebrew people, the Israelite nation. I will slay your firstborn son, because you've been slaying my firstborn son. Remember, he had them all killed. The Pharaoh, it wouldn't have been this Pharaoh, but the Pharaoh earlier had killed the firstborn sons of the Israelite people. So he says, I'm going to give you kind of a chance to make good on that. And if not, though, I'm going to slay your firstborn son. Egypt could be God's child also as a nation, but they would not be the firstborn. That's going to bug them. Of course it would. And they have to let the firstborn serve God and act as that priestly people. The firstborn son was to be the priest of every family. So the Israelites are the priests for all the nations of the world, to give them an example of how to have a relationship with God, okay? To mediate for all the other nations of the world. And he says, when he refuses, he says, I'm going to give you 10 chances, essentially, to kind of go back on this. And I'm going to then bring devastation upon you. And so the Pharaoh is actually the one who brings the devastation upon his own people by refusing the demands of Moses and God, okay? So Pharaoh, in fact, makes them work even harder. He said, if you think you deserve a day off, you must not be having enough work, so I'm going to make your lives even harder. And that's when the plagues began. So we're going to talk about those plagues today and how they literally make sense chronologically speaking. You might not have ever thought of this, but the Nile is the life of Egypt. The life of the nation comes from that water that overflowed its banks and flooded the most fertile place in the world. When the Nile, which symbolizes life, is turned to blood, which symbolizes death, that's the first, life becomes death. And the water that brought life to the whole nation of Egypt now brings death. Because what happens to all the living things in blood? They die. They can't live in blood. So the fish all die and float to the surface, right? All of the vegetation in there begins to die and decay. But so logically speaking, what is in the water that can get out is going to get out, right? If I'm in the water and you're a fish and I'm a frog and you're stuck in the water and you're going to die, but I'm not stuck in the water. So what do? I jump out of the water, and the second plague is frogs. So it does kind of make logical sense that anything that could get out of that death pit of blood would. So the frogs become the next plague. And what happens when all those frogs and all those fish that are floating, and you've all, been to the beach and you're walking along and it's a beautiful sunny day, and all of a sudden you're like knocked over by the smell of that there's a fish around here somewhere, right? And then you identify where it's at. And so what happens when all this death is all around? What's the next thing that comes? Roadkill, right? What congregates? Bugs. And the third and fourth plagues are two different types of bugs. Flies right? Gnats, they come because they're drawn to things that are decaying and putrefying, right? And all of this is happening except in one location, like one neighborhood, which is Goshen, which is the place where God's people live. So these plagues hit everybody except for them. So it's pretty obvious, like it's raining over that one, that one cartoon character, and everywhere he goes, there's rain coming just on him. Or Pigpen, in the comic books, Charlie Brown, he's always got a dust cloud around him. Like, Goshen is the only place where it's not raining or not having a plague. So then what happens next is there's a systematic breakdown of the religion of Egypt. They worshiped the Nile as a god, and now that god is dead. So God is our God. The true God is going to systematically now deconstruct the entire Egyptian religion by killing all the things that they worship. Because if something can get killed, then it can't be God. And that's the point. So if I kill your God, then it's obviously not a God, and you start rethinking, what was I worshiping? I was worshiping an animal, and we're above the animals. So the next thing that happens is, because of all the bugs that bring and spread the disease, the cattle become infested with, there's a cattle disease, essentially, and all the livestock die. So the things that they worship, cows, rams, goats, they all die. Okay, so there's another thing that they worship. All their pantheon of gods begin to die all around them. Next, he attacks them, the people themselves, with boils. Boils come on the people. This is the 6th plague, right? The boils on the people. So now they're feeling an intense pain. It's hitting their own physical bodies. Next comes hail from heaven that destroys all of the crops. So now there's no animals to eat, I guess. There's no now there's no crops to eat, and whatever's left of the vegetation in Egypt is destroyed with the 8th plague of the locusts coming. They literally come through and ravage everything. So there's no food. Egypt, that was at one point feeding the entire world, doesn't have any food for its own self to eat at all, right? We could kind of think back 400 years before in the time of Joseph, who fed the world with his plan. And finally, darkness comes. The 9th plague is darkness. So the plagues are 3, 3, and 3, 9 in all. And then the 10th one comes as like the icing on top of the cake. After the 4th plague, Pharaoh was willing to negotiate. So I've just told you all the plagues. So it literally destroyed everything all around. And now the people are in total darkness. So think about that. Total darkness, no light at all. Unless you were actually in your own home, you would be lost. Think about that. If you were walking down the street halfway across town, you can't see anything at all. It's pitch blackness. Everyone would be like lost for 3 days. I think it was 3 days of darkness. So after the 4th plague of the bugs, the flies, the Pharaoh was willing to negotiate. And he said, you can't go to sacrifice out in the wilderness, because he was afraid they wouldn't come back. Even though Moses said, we will come back. You have our word on this. He said, no, you have to make your sacrifices here. And I'll read you just an excerpt of chapter 8. He says, we cannot worship here. He said, if we, wait a minute, let me find this. 26 and 27. When Moses left, he prayed, and removed the swarms of flies. He said, we have to go into the wilderness, because if we sacrifice here, we would be killing the gods of your people, and they're not going to be okay with that. We have to do it out there. So we have to go, and plus we have to take animals for the sacrifice. They would be sacrificing the very animals that the Egyptians worshipped, and they said, that's not going to fly here, right? It's not going to fly here. Between a couple of the other plagues, and I don't remember exactly which ones, he said, before this, he said, you can go, but the animals have to stay. And Moses said, no, the animals are part of the deal. That's the sacrifice. They are the sacrifice. And then he said, you can go, you can sacrifice them here. We can't sacrifice them here. We have to sacrifice them there. The Egyptians can't see this. And finally, I love this one, somewhere between probably, 6 or 7 or 8, he says, you can go and take your animals. This one gets me, but your kids have to stay here. Your children have to stay here. And they're like, no, our children are going with us. Finally came the time that the threat had to happen. What was threatened had to come about, which was the destruction of the death of the firstborn of all of the Egyptians across the board. But God gives his people a way to save their firstborn, right? And you probably know this part of the story too. He said, this is what you must do. And this is what we're going to celebrate on Holy Thursday, right? The Passover. Jesus was celebrating a Passover meal. He said, take a lamb, a spotless lamb. And now we're thinking all the time about Jesus, right? Because all this stuff points to him. He's the Lamb of God, the perfect Son, the spotless, sinless human being. Take a lamb without blemish, sacrifice it. Let its blood go on, the blood on your door and on the top of the door, all the way around the doorpost, right? Put it on your house and eat that lamb as part of a sacred meal. And if you do those things, if you take a lamb and you sacrifice it and put its blood on your house, like let his blood go on you, eat the lamb, right? Which we do every Sunday or even every day if you go to daily mass. Eat the lamb, the Eucharist, the bread of life, right? The Lamb of God. Then the angel of death will pass over your house. And that's where the word, and a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, that's where they get that. The angel of death will come to your house and then pass it over. It will not enter because of the blood on the door. So if I have the blood of Christ on me, on my sins, if you have the blood of Christ on you, this is our house. What do we say? Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Meaning, this is my roof. This is my house. Let the blood of Christ, the blood of the Lamb on my house, in my house, eat the Lamb. Then death really can't touch us. That's the parallel here, right? Yet we worry, especially Catholics, we worry constantly. I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell. Well, aren't we doing what he said? So if they were spared, how does that mean we're all going to hell? It doesn't make sense, right? So the Passover, meaning that angel passed over their houses. Eat the lamb, and they had to eat that lamb with unleavened bread, which is where the Eucharist comes from, right? Unleavened bread, and eat as people ready to go. And Mass comes from the word meaning missa, meaning commissioned. The Mass is actually ascending. So we eat standing up, because don't we come up standing up, right? You used to kneel, but now we stand because it's connected with, we eat as people who are ready to leave. Did you ever think about how Mass kind of abruptly ends? We have communion, and then we say, go in peace. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, go in peace. It's a very abrupt ending because we're being fed not to live in here, but to live out there. Just like they were fed not to stay in Egypt, but to go out to make their way to the promised land. So the Passover lamb becomes a really strong type for Christ. If you think about his blood, like the Passover lamb's blood, saves us from eternal death, as it saved them from imminent death with the Passover, right? The blood, the unleavened bread, the lamb. The angel of death killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians, but God's people were spared. And then finally, as God said much earlier, he said to Moses, don't worry. He said, if the Pharaoh says no, 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 it's okay. Because there will come a time where he will say, get out of my country. And that's exactly what he does. He says, Moses, I never want to see your face again. Get out and take all your people with you. Well, that's what we just wanted all along. But no, did you ever think like if you could, you just want to smack that Pharaoh because he brought destruction and death upon his whole nation because of his own stubbornness and hard-heartedness. He's always called hard-hearted, right? Like a physical hardening of your heart. Pharaoh said, get out. And there they went. The Red Sea crossing comes next, right? And that's a type for our sacrament. Go over a little bit more to the baptismal font, because when they left Egypt through the waters of the Red Sea, they were living in death. They were living in slavery, darkness. Their lives were terrible. They passed through the waters of the Red Sea into freedom and joy. And it says they danced and sang and played their instruments, and that's what they did. And they celebrated because they had come through out of darkness, out of death, into life, and ultimately to the promised land, but not for a while, right? So now they're in the wilderness for 40 years. God fed them with bread from heaven, which we see as a type for the Eucharist, the manna that was there every morning once they were out in the desert and they were hungry. God said, God give us food. He gave them their daily bread. And that's why when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we say, give me today my daily bread. Give us this day our daily bread, right? Give us today what we need. It's a faith walk. They had to learn to trust God. So the manna that God gave them, that they would cook into bread, cakes of bread, they had to collect it every morning when they got up and unzipped their tents and went out there. And you could only take enough for the day. You couldn't take more, right? Because the tendency for us is to like put a little aside just in case tomorrow there's no manna on the ground. Like I'll still have food. Think about at the beginning of the pandemic, all the hoarding that happened, right? I mean, that's just human nature, right? They wanted to hoard that manna. They wanted to collect more than they needed. But then that means that they don't trust that God's going to be there tomorrow with what he promised to be there with. And so there's only one day of the week that you could collect 2 days worth. Does anybody want to guess what day that was? It was Friday. It was the sixth day because the Sabbath was Saturday and you couldn't work on the Saturday. So the manna would not come on Saturday because no one could collect it. So you could keep your manna from Friday, you could collect a double portion, and it wouldn't get wormy or moldy because you weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. So they were able to live on that bread and water from the rock. Wherever Moses went, he had a staff, and he would, because Jesus said, I am living water. And he says to the Samaritan woman at the well, I'm going to give you living water. Give me this water, sir, she said. Jesus is the living water. The Holy Spirit is the living water that keeps us alive, that flows through us, the grace that comes through us. But in the desert, we see Jesus, Jesus was present, if you will, wherever Moses went. We say that Jesus is the rock, and he's also the living water. Wherever Moses struck the rock, water would flow. So no matter where they went in the desert, there was always a stream of water. All Moses had to do was strike the rock, and there it would flow, and the people would have whatever they needed. So the water was alive wherever they went through that 40 years of the desert together. And that's what they lived on. So they had 40 years to get to know the God that they had been separated from for 40 years. It was like catechesis. It was like religious education. They had to learn to trust God, that he would be there, that he would be there for them no matter where they were, right? And after 3 months, of being out there, they came to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses had encountered God in the burning bush, right, up on the mountain. And he said, come up here and I'll give you my law. Well, he said, first of all, I'm going to visit I'm going to appear to you all. The people, this is so funny. The people are like, woo, God's coming. They have no idea, right, what that means. And I'll walk over here for this. So God is called the Great Theophany. Theo means God. Theology, which is what I teach, which I just came from school. I taught the first 2 classes. My freshman theology class, the study of God. Like biology, the study of life. Bio, life. Theo, God. Theology. A theophany is an appearance of God. So like Pentecost, the fire was a theophany of sorts, right? The burning bush is this little tiny, theophany that Moses saw just himself. But God says, I'm coming and everyone will encounter me, which is great. They think that's the greatest thing ever. And he says, no one touch the mountain. Do not set 1 foot on the mountain. You must stay away from the mountain. For 3 days you must purify yourself. Again, 3 days, 3, 3, 3, 7, 7, 7, all these numbers. 3, and God, that's a number 3, the Trinity, God, that's a number for God. 3 days, purify yourselves, and then I'm going to come. And if anyone, man or beast, touches or steps 1 foot on the mountain, they'll die instantly and all of that. And nobody did. I don't think anybody did. And after 3 days came, God came, and the cloud descended upon the mountain, and thunder and lightning and fire and trumpets and earthquakes and everything. And the people ran away. They ran as far as they could. And they said to Moses later, from now on, you can go ahead and talk to God, just you, and just tell us what he says. Tell us what he says. Like they did not want that anymore. They did not like that. It was so from then on, Moses was their mediator. And that's okay. That's just the way. I just think that's hilarious, though. So he goes up the mountain by himself, of course, because they don't want any part of up there. They're afraid up there. And he goes for 40, another important number in the Bible. For 40 days, Moses is up on the mountaintop. And Moses is given the 10 Commandments, which I think this is so beautiful, that he and God inscribed together. Like, think how cool that is. Just whatever that means, it just sounds amazing. God and Moses carved, into the tablets together the 10 Commandments together. And if you think 2 more, I'm going to break this down for you. There's 10 Commandments. And 10 is 3 plus 7. 3 being a God number, and 7 just being a perfect number. And if you think about it, think about the vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension, which gives us a cross anyway, if you think about it in terms of that. The first 3 commandments have to do with our relationship with God. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have any gods before me. Keep holy the Sabbath day. Do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, right? 1, 2, 3. And the rest are horizontal. They have, don't kill me. I'm not going to steal from you. I'm not going to commit adultery with you. You know what I mean? I'm not going to lie about you. I'm not going to covet your stuff. I'm going to honor you. So 3 have a vertical dimension and 7 have a horizontal dimension. And again, 2 perfect numbers coming together in what's called the Decalogue. Log meaning law, deca meaning 10, right? A decathlon is 10 Olympic events in one, right? All together, 10, Decalogue. So God gave him not only, and this is the part that nobody knows, the last part of the book of Exodus, which never makes it into the movies, it's just done, is God gives Moses not only the 10 commandments by which the people can live in right relationship with God and each other, right? This is a 40-year camping trip. There's got to be some rules. You know what I mean? There's got to be some rules because this is not an easy journey. But what he also gave them was the plans. He gave him the plans for the tabernacle. like that, but square. It's rectangular. Do you remember the Raiders of the Lost Ark? Right? Indiana Jones. He was trying to find the lost ark. That's what Moses was given the plans for. That's what that movie was actually about. The plans for the Ark of the Covenant that went into the tent, which became together the sanctuary. And the plans involved a tabernacle, like ours, inside of a tent. The tent was made out of gold thread, indigo blue thread, royal purple thread, and deep, like blood red, scarlet red thread. So think about those liturgical colors that we use. Advent, Lent, right? Those, and gold. The tent housed the tabernacle, the ark, I should say, and in which was put some of the manna, Moses' staff that he brought water from the rock and brought all the plagues, right? And the 10 Commandments went in there. So all their holy stuff went in there. It was like a time capsule almost, right? And that's what was put in there, inside of a tent. And in front of that altar, in front of that sanctuary, or that ark, or tabernacle, which was where they put the presence of God. The law, the manna, and the staff of Moses. In front of that was a courtyard where there was a table, where there were candles, and of course they had a menorah, which is a seven candle symbolizing the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And on the altar was called, they would put what's called the showbread. The showbread. And what do we put on the altar? The Eucharist comes on the altar for us. The showbread. It's not for show, but it's literally the plans that Moses was given that had to be kept, done. It had to be specific. This gold encrusted ark box. It's a box just like the ark, Noah's ark. Remember, we called it the same thing. And that little basket that Moses was down the river in. Remember, we connected those last week. The ark is now not a giant boat, but it's a rectangular box that houses all the hope and the life, just like Moses in that little, right? And just like Noah and all the animals, all the life was in there. So here we see it again. And it's actually called the ark again. So, let me think where I was. So, if you look at the entire plans, and I draw this on the board for my kids, because we look right in the Bible. I don't have time to read it all to you, because it's like 5 or 6 chapters of like specific, this is how it has to be, and how long, and how tall, and what's in, it's lined with cedar, because cedar keeps bugs away. That's just, a lot of it's like practical, cedar wood. You have a cedar chest at home, right? My parents have a cedar chest that all of our special stuff goes in. And I don't know if you know this, but many tabernacles in churches have cedar, they're cedar lined. Because we never want a bug to get in there and munch on Jesus, right? We don't want that. So we put cedar wood inside. Ours doesn't have that. It doesn't always have it. But some does, and you can actually smell that cedar. It smells really good. So he gives Moses the plans for the tabernacle / tent / sanctuary that would become the Ark of the Covenant, the centerpiece, which would be God's throne and house on earth. And once they built this, and remember all the tribes are around, there are 3 tribes that would go before the ark, 3 would follow the ark, 3 would walk. They marched in like a military formation wherever they traveled. 3 in front, 3 in back, 3 on the right, 3 on the left. And they even tell you which ones are in the front, which ones are in the back, and all of that stuff. And they protected it like in a beehive. In the very center of that hive is the life, the queen. There's only one queen per hive, right? They have to produce another one if something happens to that queen. they treated this ark like bees treat the queen. Because the queen has, without her, there is no life in the hive. The hive completely just dies. The people, though, when Moses is up there getting the plans, getting the 10 Commandments, they get impatient. They need something to worship. They're uncomfortable worshiping just this unseen kind of God. So you know the story, the golden calf. They build. The calf was an Egyptian god of fertility, which tells you what they were doing when they were worshiping this calf. It was sexual in nature. It's called debauchery. And Moses comes down and finds all the people. And what happens? He says to his brother, where did this calf come from? And just like Adam and Eve, who want to blame everybody else, Aaron, his brother, says, well, I collected all the people made me do this. They forced me, and I took all their jewelry, and I threw it in the fire, and out popped this God. He says, that doesn't work that way, right? No. So much for the covenant we just made, right? They had made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai. God was actually ready to disown them. Just like back in the days of Noah, when it says God regretted making the human race. He's ready to disown them. I'm going to go down to chapter 32. He says, 25 to 29, just really fast here. Moses saw that the people were running wild because Aaron had lost control. Moses stood at the gate of the camp and shouted, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And at this point, something very interesting happens. His tribe, the Levites rallied with Moses. He told them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, each of you put your sword on your hip, go back and forth through the camp from gate to gate, and kill your brothers, your friends, and your neighbors. Big punishment. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day 3,000 of the people fell. And Moses said to them, today you are installed as the priests for the Lord, for you went against your own kin and to bring a blessing upon yourselves this day. So what essentially happened was every firstborn son was the priest of his family. But the firstborn of the tribes, worshiped the golden calf. So they relinquished their right to be the priests because they worshiped the false gods. So Moses rallies the Levite, his brothers and sisters, his brothers in the Levite tribe. They kill all the firstborn of all the other tribes. And Moses now, because they relinquished that right, he said, now the Levites alone will serve as the priests. And that's how that came about. The Levites then became their own they have a special office. That's why this series is called Priests, Prophets, and Kings. We see how these came about. And we know that you're not supposed to be more than one of those at a time. And so the Levites from then on are the priests. To this day, if you are a Levite, you know it. If you're Jewish, you know what tribe you might not know what tribe exactly you're from, except if you are a Levite, you know. They know. Every firstborn was now to be a priest, but not anymore. The tabernacle was built. God enters it and leads the people for 40 years, by day with a pillar of fire, cloud, by night as a pillar of fire. Verse 35 of chapter 40. So Genesis is 50 chapters long, and that's easy to remember because 50 is a pretty even number, right? And Exodus is 40 chapters long. Again, it's very easy to remember. 40 years in the desert, it's 40 chapters long. And this is what it says in verse 35. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it and the glory of the Lord filled it. It overshadowed it. There's only three times in the scriptures when the word overshadowed is used. Very important stuff. And we're going to get to that. It's
So they build the tent, they build the altar, they put up the candles, they put the ark, the tabernacle, they get it all ready, and then literally they pray, hopefully we did everything right. Step back, because God's coming. And we see if God's going to choose to enter this or not. Is he going to enter this sanctuary and live with us and guide us for the next 40 years or not? And sure enough, it says, the glory of God overshadowed the ark and filled it with his glory. There's only two other times that happens. One, in the temple in Jerusalem when Solomon finally builds it. And again, we step back and pray that God finds it acceptable. And it says the power of the Most High overshadowed it and filled it. And where's the third time? The Blessed Mother. How will this happen? And the angel says, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born in you, within you, is the Son of God, the presence. So Mary is the tabernacle. Mary is the temple for us as the New Testament, right? So you're going to connect that, hopefully, connect those things.
Only 3 times does that happen with that word being used. Only 3 times in thousands of pages, right? There's not a coincidence, right? Mary becomes the tabernacle of the New Testament. And then we do too, as Jesus houses himself in us when we receive Holy Communion, right? For a little while, we're tabernacles too. Following Exodus is the book of Leviticus, and it teaches people, and where does that come from? Levi, the tribe of Levi. The Levites, the priestly tribe now, because they've been set apart. Leviticus means the book of the Levites. And it tells the people how to live in right relationship with God. All their religious rules and regulations and what you can eat and what you can't eat and, what constitutes leprosy and all the things that specifically deal with the worship of God is in the book of Leviticus, followed by Numbers. The book of Numbers is so called because at the beginning and at the end of the book, one is they take a census when they get
out into the desert. They take a census of all the tribes. How many men, how many women, how many children, how much grain, how many barrels of olive oil, whatever. They count it all up, numbers. And then at the end of the 40 years, they count it up again. And you notice that, and I don't have time to go into all this, but certain tribes thrive and certain tribes don't and get very small because maybe they weren't faithful. It's all for teaching purposes, obviously. And in between the two censuses, and it's funny because kids, like my students, don't remember, they don't know always what a census is because they haven't really lived through many, like they're 14. So, when we had one in 2020, it was right in the middle of the pandemic and it kind of got lost on a lot of people. They were 10, not 8, 10 or 11 years old. They weren't paying attention to the census. They had enough to worry about. And 10 years earlier, they were only 3 or whatever, 4 years old, 5 years old. So I have to kind of really explain even what a census is to them and what the purpose is of it. But it comes from the book of Numbers. That's where we have these censuses coming. And in between, it tells more stories. One of the stories that is only in the book of Numbers is a story that's very interesting. It's the story of the bronze serpent. So when the people, there's a tie to the cross, and that's why I don't want to pass it up. So the people are grumbling against God. He calls them, you know how Pharaoh was hard-hearted, right? He calls the people of Israel stiff-necked. Think about that. And it makes sense. Because they're out in the desert, they're trying to go to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, but they keep looking back. And they say stuff like, we're starving out here. We had plenty of food back in Egypt. Maybe we should go back there. What, and be slaves? Because that's all that's back there for you. Would you rather die free or live a slave? You know, and the kids all say 100%, let me die free than live a slave. And I agree with them. But they keep looking back at Egypt, thinking like they don't remember how bad it was back there. You know, sometimes once we get out of a bad situation, we don't remember just how bad it was. And we think, you know, well, some people are much more comfortable in a terrible, familiar situation rather than an unfamiliar situation that's a lot nicer. Some people are just happier knowing in a familiar environment, even though it's a terrible situation. They're afraid to get out of it. That's what happened to the people. So God sends serpents to bite the people, and they die. And then they, oh, we're so sorry, you know. And the serpent reminds us of the serpent in the desert, or in the Garden of Eden. And these seraph serpents came and they bite the people because sin kills us. And they represent sin killing us. And they beg and plead with Moses, please send some relief from this. And God says, create a serpent out of bronze and mount it on a pole. Not that Jesus is sin, because he isn't, but he takes our sin on himself. So he who is without sin becomes sin, like the serpent, right? He becomes sin, our sins, so that we can all live. And he's on a pole, he's not a bronze serpent on a pole, but our sins are laid upon him on the cross. And then he says, if anybody looks at the serpent, raise up the pole with the serpent, and anyone who looks on it will not die. And we believe that we look to the cross, and he's our life, and we won't die if we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, right? He's always going to lead us the right direction. So that's just one of those interesting things that is only in the book of Numbers. So you don't want to skip it completely. The only other one that I don't even have written down that I'll share with you is, if anybody thinks that God in any way thinks that discrimination is okay, it isn't. A lot of people don't know this. Moses' wife was black. She was African. Not Egyptian, but because the Egyptians are lighter skin. But she was actually black. She was African, deeper African. So Moses and his wife were a biracial couple. Nobody knows that, because why would you know that? So their kids were biracial, and at some point, Moses' sister, Miriam, who was like the hero last week, starts to kind of have issues with her African sister-in-law, and we don't exactly know what happened there that created that rift between the two of them, but she was talking about her in a derogatory way, and God punishes her by making her a snow white leper for a time. So her skin became as white as possible, but that meant she had leprosy. And then, of course, she was healed and all of that stuff. But so God has a sense of humor too, in a way. You know what I mean? You don't like your sister-in-law's black skin? I'll give you the whitest skin imaginable as a leper. We'll see how you like that for a few days. And she didn't like that at all. Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible, and it's the final sermon of Moses. I don't know if any of you ever saw The Last Lecture. It's on YouTube. It's very good. It was written by a college professor who had terminal illness, terminal cancer, and he gave his last lecture to us. And they caught it. It's wonderful, and it's really very beautiful. Moses had one of those too. It's his last lecture. It's on the other end of the 40 years. They're sitting on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to go into the Promised Land, and he says, "All right, not yet. Sit down. Have a seat. And now remember all that God did for you." And he goes through all that God did for them. He goes through how he punished the Egyptians, and how he led them into freedom, and how he took them through the sea, and how he fed them from the sky, and how he brought water from the rock, and etc. He reminds them of all the things that God did for them, and he says,
If you forget these things, you're going to revert back into your old ways. Be faithful, and you'll live in this land. If you're not, you're going to die. Life or death, blessing or curse. And then on the end of the promised land, Moses leaves the people there and goes up into the mountains and dies.
Moses never makes it into the promised land. And a lot of people don't know that either. Moses was part of the old generation that doubted the Lord. And one time, and this is a punishment, I feel like this is too severe of a punishment. Moses, God said, strike the rock and I will bring water for the people. And the people were grumbling, and instead of, I think he was to strike the rock, he actually struck the rock twice. And in other words, he was taking credit as if he was showing that he was bringing the water from the rock and not God. And God did not like that. And so he said to Moses, you will not go into the promised land. Even though he's the leader, he doesn't get to go into the promised land. And it says here, very beautiful, that God buried Moses. Like, God buried Moses in a secret cave that nobody's ever been able to find. And that's how the book of that's how the book of Deuteronomy ends, with Moses dying and God burying him in a secret place that no one will ever be able to find. The next phase becomes the period called the conquest. And this is several hundred years long. The main character of this at the beginning is called Joshua. We still have time, so I'm going to keep going. We still have plenty of time here because I want to be able to finish in 5 days. Moses' successor is called Joshua. And because Moses wasn't allowed in to the promised land, they need a new leader. And Joshua's of the younger generation that did not sin against the Lord. And they are going to go in and start taking over what used to be theirs. But remember, that was 450 years ago. So it's not still yours. I always say to the kids, if you go on a trip and come back 50 years, or even 10 years later, your house is going to have somebody else in it. I mean, and imagine if it was 500 years later. You might say, this was my house. No, it's not your house. Prove it. When did you have this? 450 years ago. This belonged to my great-grandparents or whatever. Nobody's going to believe it. So they have to take back the Holy Land piece by piece. And the first target is a city called Jericho. And you've heard of Jericho probably. Then the walls of Jericho came crumbling down. There's songs written about this stuff, right? So what happens is they're still camped out across the Jordan River. They're on the eastern side of the river. They've come kind of around from down here around, or from your perspective, they're coming this way. And here's the river, and here's the Holy Land. And they're camped out across the river Jordan. So there was the Red Sea on the other end of that 40 years, and now there's water of the Jordan River, significant river for us, right, as Christians too. And they're gonna go in through there. They have to cross water on both sides. To get out of slavery, they have to go through the water of the Red Sea, and to get into the promised land from the desert in between for 400 years, they have to cross water. Again, like a baptism almost, right? A brand new start. So Israel was a nation unlike any other, and they had God as their king. They didn't have an actual king. They had Moses, who was their leader and a prophet, guided, though, by God all the time. So they're going to take over Jericho, which is considered by archaeologists to be the oldest city in the world. The oldest city in the world. They send spies, and there's 10 spies that go in to check things out. And they're going to bring back a report for, to see what they need to do to take this city over. And they meet this woman who's really important, and her name is Rahab. Rahab is, she's called a harlot, but she's not like a prostitute. She's like an innkeeper. And Jericho was a walled city with thick walls. Has anybody been to a city with a wall around it? Anybody in Europe maybe or different places? So, these walls are not like this thick. You can drive a car around these things. They're big, thick walls. What I love about this is, and I love to draw this on the board for the kids, is Rahab's house, or her inn, was built into the wall of the city. So you could go in from the inside of the city, you would go into her house, but there were also windows that you could look out of the city on the other side of her house, right? And she had like a 2 or 3 story, however high the wall was, she owned like a chunk of this wall, was her inn and her house. And the spies go there because they find out that she is a God-fearing person, that she worships the God of Israel somehow, right? Somehow she is a person who, let me remember what it actually says here. It says here that she believed in Israel's God. She believed in Israel's God. So they're like, we can trust this thing. So they go to her, and once they get into the city, they begin to talk about them. And the king of Jericho sends, guards to find the spies, to kill them. And she hides them in her house. She hides them on the rooftop of her house, which is on the wall, the top of the wall. And she says to them, I'll help you if you help me. And they say, we'll help you. She said, I'm going to hide you and keep you safe, but then when you destroy the city, you must save my family, because we believe in the God of Israel. And they said, we will, no problem. So this is what they tell her. Now, draw a parallel to this, right? They say, when we leave and when the armies of Israel come and surround Jericho, take a red cord and put it around the window of your house. So remember the blood of the lamb around the door? This is not blood. This is a red cord, but it's a parallel to that story. And your family and your house will be spared. So just like the Passover, there's going to be another Passover for your family who believes in the God of Israel. She let them she lowered them out of the window of her house, outside of the city, and off they scurried and hopped back across the river and told the report and all of that. And then something very cool happened. The priests, the ark, the tabernacle, could only be transported on the shoulders of the Levites. That's how it moved. So you'd have poles and, however many Levites on one side and on the other, and they would have a pole, and then the tabernacle was in the middle, and that's how it moved. And they came to the Jordan River, and they stepped, as soon as the first priest stepped into the waters parted, and they went in. That's how they got in. So it's very similar to what happened 400 years earlier, or 40 years earlier at the Red Sea. Not quite as dramatic, to be honest, right? It's kind of downscaled a little bit because the Red Sea is giant and the Jordan River is not that big. But it says they parted it and they walked through. And as soon as all of the Israelites were through, the water flowed again, just like normal. And they built an altar there with 12 pillars, so they would always remember that this is where they crossed. And to be honest, I have to tell you, geographically, we're talking about the same place that Jesus was baptized. I mean, it's geographically the same place, right? Because of where we know Jericho to be in relationship to other things. So, again, it's very cool. God is doing this all. It's a giant plan, right? That he just keeps rolling it out. It's pretty awesome. And they go to Jericho, and they silently march around the city once a day for 7 days. And at the end of the 7th day, they blow the horns, like the ram's horn. So there's not a single like weapon involved. And it just simply says that when they, on the 7th time around, or whatever it was, 7 days and 7 times, they blew the ram's horn, and the people gave a great shout, and all the walls, it says the walls of Jericho all just came crumbling to the ground. And they were able to, except one section where there was a red cord. It's cool. I mean, I love it. This is,
this is like God repeating himself, kind of rhyming with himself over and over again. Rahab, married an Israelite man, and she is actually, you don't remember this, but when I read for you, almost a month ago, that genealogy from Matthew's gospel, Rahab is one of the 4 women mentioned in that. And we didn't even know who she was, like a few weeks ago, right? But she's in there, and she married an Israelite, and she becomes a direct ancestor of King David, which means that she is a direct ancestor of Jesus, this Jericho lady, right? This unlikely person. The people under Joshua were basically faithful. They were. Eventually, Joshua, at 110, because everybody lives a really long time back then, told them at Shechem, he took the people to Shechem, and he sat them all down, and he said to them, at the same place that God had promised Abraham and Sarah that he would give them the land, he says to the people that they have a choice between the gods of the people around them or the one true God. And then he has this very famous thing that he says, you must decide for yourselves, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And just for me personally, I'll just share a personal story. Like when I was a kid, like in my parents' house, they still live in the same house that we've always lived in. Everybody uses the back door. And when you go in the back door, you can go straight down the steps into the basement, or you can take a left and go up 3 little steps into the kitchen. That's just where it's at. And right there, I didn't know the significance of this when I was a kid, but right there was a little wooden thing that was carved, and it said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And not until many, many years later did I realize that, that came from the book of Joshua. And my parents were obviously, making a statement to whoever came into our house that, we're a God-fearing house. Whatever, we serve the Lord in this house. And they said, we will serve the Lord too. And they did for a while, because it's never forever. And the conquest period kind of bleeds into the next period called the period of the Judges. And the catchphrase for the time, the Judges, and we're still going right into the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. I mean, we're still like, for a while, it follows the story, just continually goes right through. You can start at the beginning of the Bible and read, for several books, quite a few books, until it starts to kind of get out of order. But for now, it is. The period of the Judges, when I say to the kids, every book of the Bible from Genesis through Judges has a catchphrase, or has something that, like Genesis means the beginning of things. The kids have to know this. This is my class. Exodus means a way out. Okay. They have to know what that means. Like an exit. EX. Exit, Exodus. That's the way out of Egypt. Leviticus, the Levite, holiness, priestly tribe. These are the rules. Numbers, because of the census at the beginning and at the end. None of this is, rocket science. But some of them miss a lot, I'm just saying, because they're terrible test takers. Deuteronomy means second law. That's Moses' second time he's going through everything and reminding them of everything. Joshua's catchphrase is, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And for the book of Judges, I simply draw a roller coaster, and even with like loops and everything. And I say, that's the catchphrase for the book. That's the catchphrase for the book of Judges. Because it's literally a roller coaster of their relation. Like they do great, and then they do terrible. And then they do great, and then they are terrible. When they need God, everything's great, and we love God, and we're serving God, and then we get everything the way we want it, and then we forget about God. And then everything goes crappy for a while. And so when I say to them, on the test, you just simply have to draw a roller coaster, and it has to involve one upside down section. Just jokingly, and then, they always have a loop in there. They always include a loop, because I told them to. And, but this is the actual, I would say, verse that sums up this 400 period of time, called the book, The Time of the Judges. In Israel,
Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So anarchy. It's relativity. It's like, well, I think this is right and you think this is wrong. So go ahead. I'm going to do it because I think it's right. It's whatever I say, whatever I want to be right is right. And that's not objective. It's just not objectively like that. According to God, God says no. You can't just decide. Morality is morality. And but it's anarchy. And even the Levite priests during this period had become mercenaries, getting rich on the sacrifices of the poor. When things got darkest, God would send a judge. It's not a judge like a court of law judge. These judges were they're called soldier prophets. Soldier prophet. They were leaders that emerged, that God would send to the people. There were 12 judges, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. Much later, there were 12 judges. 12, and one of them was even a woman, Deborah, and she was a soldier prophet. Who knew that there would be a woman military leader thousands of years before Jesus? But there were, so that's good. And they would rescue them, and everything would be good for a while, and then they'd fall into idolatry again. They had never fully driven out the Canaanites, who were the people who had taken over the land during that 400-year period that they were away. And the Canaanites were known for their stone houses and their temples. They were very sophisticated. And these were very attractive to the Israelites who had been nomadic, living in tents. They were still nomadic at this point. So I have a tent, you have a stone house. I want your house. I don't want a tent. I want to live like you live. So they start taking on the ways of the Canaanites, but that also usually includes taking on their worship of their false gods. So, and idolatry is sin number one, always, sin number one. To make matters worse, in addition to the Canaanites, the Philistines, who you may have heard of, because Goliath, remember David and Goliath? Goliath was that giant soldier. He was a Philistine. The Philistines were a nation that kind of mysteriously, their origins are kind of mysterious, but it says they came from the sea. So they came across the Mediterranean from somewhere, I don't know where, and maybe Philistia, I guess it would be Philistines. But they had come onto the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. They arrived on the coast, and they became the Israelites' worst enemies. Among the other judges that you may have heard of were Gideon and Samson and Delilah. Remember his story? We don't have time to go into that, but the next book that I want to talk about is the book of Ruth. Ruth comes, and the reason why we know that we can place Ruth in this timetable right here in the time of the judges, because it says, Ruth's book says, in the time of the judges, there was a man who married a woman, and they had 2 sons, and they moved to Moab, and etc. And one of those, the sons married 2 Moabite women. Now, the Moabites lived on the other side of the Jordan River, which is where the Israelites had camped out before they went into the promised land through the water. But these are foreigners. They were in a foreign country still. So they marry these Moabite girls, and then all the men die. The husband of the father died, and both sons died, leaving a widow and then 2 younger widows. And the older widow says to the young girls, her daughters-in-law, who are also widows, "You're young, I'm going back home to Israel, but it's not going to be easy over there. We're widows. Stay here, remarry, start a new life. You were young enough." And one said, "All right, I'll see you later," and off she went. And the other one said, "No, I'm sticking with you." And her name is Ruth. And the catchphrase of the book of Ruth is, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And her story is very beautiful because it shows Ruth to be sensitive and loyal, beyond belief. And she ends up falling in love with a man, an Israelite, because they come back. She comes back with her mother-in-law.
And she ends up marrying a barley farmer called Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth have a son. I forget his name right now. It's in the genealogy. Their son was somebody. And then his son was Jesse from Bethlehem. And Jesse, because they moved to Bethlehem. So again, this is more than 1,000 years before Jesus, and we've already buried Rachel outside of Bethlehem, right? Back in the days of Isaac and Jacob. Jacob's wife, his favorite wife, Rachel, was buried outside of Bethlehem in the cemetery outside of Bethlehem. Now we have Ruth coming across from Moab with her mother-in-law, falling in love and marrying a barley farmer from Bethlehem named Boaz, who had Obed. Sorry, okay, I did remember his name. She married Boaz. They had Obed, who had Jesse, and Jesse became the father of David, the king. So again, we have Rahab, the Jericho innkeeper, who's a foreigner in our genealogy. And we also have Ruth, a Moabite, who's a direct descendant, a direct ancestor of Jesus too. So we have at least 2 foreigners involved. So Jesus' line is not strictly Jewish. It's not 100%. And I just think that's really interesting because that was so important to a lot of the Jewish people. But if they really looked back into their own history, and even the history even of King David, the king, he has 2 women in his direct ancestral line, in his family tree, that are, from other places. So it's like almost God saying, even way back then, that the Messiah is not just strictly for the Jewish people. He's got connections to like other countries, the Gentile countries, the non-Jewish people. And this is all really, really important. And Ruth becomes important. I mean, she was a barley farmer's wife. I mean, so she doesn't do anything like super heroic. I mean, she's just a really nice person who didn't abandon her widowed mother-in-law. But I'm sure a lot of people are that nice too. She's famous because of her descendant, the king, who will be King David, who we're going to meet. But back up a little bit before that, because we have to kind of rewind a tiny bit. This is all happening during the time of the judges. So I guess we're not rewinding. We're just saying that at some point in time, the last judge comes along, and his name is Samuel. And many of you know his story. I remember his story from when I was a little kid, so I think you probably do too. Not because I study this and teach it. I remember his story from just hearing it in church. He has a miraculous birth, just like Isaac, Abraham and Sarah, at 100 years old, have a child, right? His mother cannot get pregnant. She prays and prays and prays. God gives her a son. She gives him back to God. She lets him be raised in the temple. And he sleeps by the tabernacle. The tabernacle, the ark, they still have it. It's just been there the whole time. And it's in a place called Shiloh. And he sleeps next to the ark, which I always thought was really beautiful. Like when you think about it, it's like sleeping under the tabernacle, like right next to God all the time. And it was that story that makes him famous. It's the story when he's sleeping and he hears Samuel. Do you remember that story? And he says, oh, the old guy in the next room, Eli, is probably calling me. What? What do you want? Eli's like, what? Go back to bed. I didn't call you. Okay. Samuel. He calls him again. Did you call me? No, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. He goes back again. The 3rd time, did you call me? No. Oh, ding. The light bulb goes over, and Eli, who, it's important to remember, has not heard the voice of God, so he wasn't recognizing it because he was not that great, and his sons were bad. They were bad priests. But he says, the next time you hear that voice, respond and tell that voice that you are basically at that voice's service. Like I'm putting my life at the service of God. And he does that. A couple other things happen in the early life of Samuel that I'll mention here. We're kind of getting to the end of our time, but Eli has 2 sons named Hophni and Phinehas.
And they're not good. They're selfish, they're bad priests. They're still of the priestly family somehow, but they're bad. I mean, because the Levites aren't perfect just because they're Levites, they're people. And they decide, because they're going into battle, they say, wouldn't it be great if we took God into the battle with us? Because then if we take God into the battle, we're sure to win. So they're going to use God for their own selfish gains. God is not okay with that. So when they go into the battle and they take the tabernacle with them, which, I mean, that's not a good idea. They are killed in the battle, and the ark is stolen and taken back with the enemy. And they take it back, and they put it, of all places, this is the presence of God. They put the ark in their god Dagon's temple. And Dagon is this giant statue, almost like a phallic symbol statue. And the ark is next to this giant statue. And they close and lock the temple, and the next day they come and unlock the temple, and this giant statue is prostrate before the ark. Like this 10-ton, 50-foot tall statue is literally on its face, nose to the ground. In other words, the true God, the false God. I love that story. I think that's a cool story. And then God sends, ready? He sends a plague of mice upon that group, and he sends a plague of hemorrhoids. Hemorrhoids. What a plague, right? And they send the ark back. It's hilarious. They put it on something. I think they tie it to, like, I don't know what they do. I swear I always pictured it like they have it on a horse and they just hit the horse and the horse drives it back to where it's supposed to be. And back to Shiloh it goes. But that whole family, their time is coming to an end. And let me see where we're at. We're about 1:11, or 11:11. Yeah, this is going to actually work out really perfectly. Samuel is very loyal, and he asks the people later in his life, have I done anything to offend you? And they say, you literally have been the best guy ever. You have never let us down even one time. But they say, but we still would like a king. We want you to appoint a king over us. And listen to this. This is kind of a sad statement. They say, we would like to be like all the other nations. And Samuel's like, but you're not. Like, you're that special nation. And they're like, yeah, but we want to be like everybody else. And boy, I think, I say to kids, why does everybody want to fit in when everybody was born to stand out? Like, think about that. We want to be like everybody else. But we have the most special thing going on here, because we're not like everybody else. And Samuel takes that he's personally offended by this. And he goes to God and he says, because he speaks to God, and he says to God, the people want, as if God doesn't know this already. He says, the people want a king like everybody else has. And God said, listen, it's not you that they're rejecting. It's me as their king. You're just the prophet. I'm the king. They're rejecting me as their king. Give them a king, but make sure they know what that means. It means that when they appoint a king, that means taxes, because he has to raise an army. And that army needs to be fed. Where's the army coming from? Your sons are going to be the army. Your daughters are going to feed the army. Your daughters are going to make my weapons and they're going to sew and clean for me and cook for us. And there's things that are going to happen if you become like every other nation. And they say, we still want that. And God says, okay. And so from the tiniest tribe of all, this is perfect timing. I love this, 11:13 and a half. From the tiniest tribe of Benjamin, the little brother, remember the littlest brother of all the 12 tribes, the baby brother, from that tribe comes the first king of Israel named Saul. King Saul. Saul is going to be, he was called handsome, and he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He was very, very tall, very, very handsome, very, very strong, and at first a very good leader. But that's not going to last. So you ready? We got one more day, and we'll make it to the end. All right? So thanks for being here. And I have a funeral coming in here, so you're probably going to see people start coming in. Erie Homes for Children and Adults we're having a memorial service, Mark and I, for 2 of their recently deceased people. So they're going to be bringing in a lot of wheelchairs and such. So just so you know, as you're going, they're going to be coming in. So all right, we'll see you next time. All right, have a good one.